Order. We come now to the adjournment. The whip to move.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I was first elected to this place in 2010, I never thought that I would find myself standing up to challenge the government about the decimation of the UK's sheep industry. The ancient practice of shepherding is as old as the hills, but it's now facing an unprecedented challenge brought by the threat of a no-deal Brexit. The threat of no deal brings with it a man-made Boris-built disaster that could harm so many sectors, from chemicals to cars, food to pharmaceuticals, steel to services. Virtually every area of economic activity in this country would be hit, but that includes the sheep industry. The idea that the rearing of lambs could be so comprehensively, cruelly and deliberately threatened by our own government's decision is beyond belief. Keeping sheep is already a vulnerable business, and a no-deal Brexit would just add to the problems. The unprecedented loss of markets and the imposition of tariffs and barriers will severely harm this industry.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. Does she not agree with me that this is yet another example of privileged, idle, old Etonians who could not care less about the lives and livelihoods of hard-working hill farmers in Wales and across the UK?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. This, for me, I represent an urban constituency, but even in urban Darlington, there are agricultural workers whose jobs would be affected by the effect of a no-deal Brexit on the sheep industry. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you for giving way and consider bringing this matter to the House for consideration. I did speak to the Honourable Lady today, and perhaps our opinion on Brexit is very, very different. But the Conservative government have indicated that as long as they have the power to do so, they will maintain the grants that are available for the farmers and the sheep farmers in particular. And does she feel if that was maintained, that the offset and the problem that there might be in the deficit there would be in lamb prices could be offset by the government's commitment to ensuring that what the EU gives now, this government will also give?
Well, I'm afraid if it was that simple, we wouldn't need this debate. This is not just about farm payments, this is about loss of market. And I think that's something that hasn't been properly understood, and the government hasn't given a decent account of what it intends to do to address. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
And she'll know that Scotland is home to 1/5 of the entire UK sheep flock, and much of that work has been done by farmers and croppers in less favoured areas, such as my own Argyll and Bute constituency. And leaving the European Union without a deal would have a devastating effect on farmers and croppers. So would you join me in urging the government to listen to the words of Andrew McCormick of the Scottish National Farmers Union, who said unequivocally that a no deal must be avoided because our farmers need the security and the fair access to European markets?
I agree with that. And one of the specific problems that the farmers he's describing face is the unique characteristics that their flocks possess that once gone may never ever be able to be bred back into our national flock. The principle, I give way to the honourable gentleman first.
Isn't the heart of the problem here, but lamb would not be competitive if it had a 48% tariff placed on it. I mean, that's an absolutely ridiculous situation, and the government might talk about short-term subsidies to help the situation immediately, but that is no way to save the industry as a whole.
That is absolutely right. I give way to the honourable lady.
I thank the honourable lady for giving way. This will certainly devastate hill farmers in my constituency. But not only that, the impact that that will then have on the landscapes, because many people don't realise that our landscapes are the way they are because of grazing.
The honourable lady makes an excellent point, and that is why constituents, even in urban Darlington, care about what happens to our national flock and what happens to the livelihoods of those tens of thousands of people who work so hard to keep our landscape the way that it is. I give way to the honourable lady.
I thank the honourable lady for giving way. I wonder if she was as disturbed as me to hear the Leader of the House speak so casually of trading purely under WTO rules earlier this evening, given that analysis from the AHDB suggests WTO tariffs could add anything between 38% to 91% to the price of sheep meat for EU buyers, which would be catastrophic for the sector.
I do agree, and I'll be referring to that report that she mentioned later in my speech. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. Last week I went to the Upper Teesdale Agricultural Support Service, and their concern is that because the government has failed to bring forward the agriculture bill, they're not clear whether the government has the legal powers to make payments in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Does she agree? The Minister must answer that point this evening.
That's the first time I've heard that point made in this House, and it's one that the Honourable Lady and I discussed earlier today, and she's absolutely right. Farmers need to hear from the Minister what he intends to do about their payments and to make sure that he does have the power to make those payments. The principal problem here is, for the sheep sector, is that under no deal, according to the report that the Honourable Lady mentioned, that the export of sheep meat to the EU 27 would be almost entirely wiped out. The only exports being those via a tariff rate quota of less than 400 tonnes. Now, of course, non-EU exports could in time increase, although the possible rise of around 5% would not be anywhere near enough to offset the loss of EU trade. So reduced trade with the EU would leave around 1/3 of UK meat without a market. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you. Can I congratulate my friend, honourable friend from Darlington, say she's absolutely correct to raise concerns about the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the sheep industry in Britain, and nowhere is that impact felt more than in Wales. And in acknowledging the work that the NFU Cymru and the Farmers Union of Wales does on behalf of Welsh farmers, can I point out that all of the Welsh land sent out of the UK, of that, 96% of it goes to the 27 other nations in the EU. If we don't get this right, sheep farmers in Wales will be pushed to breaking point, and we can't allow that.
This affects every region of the country, from the Lakeland, Fells, to Exmoor, to Teesdale, where I live. It affects everywhere. And people are saying that why does this matter? Surely this just means that there'll be more lamb for the UK market, the price will be cut and we can all enjoy more lamb this Christmas. But the problem is that we just do not have the facilities to safely slaughter, store and freeze that volume of lamb in the UK. And if the Minister plans to introduce such facilities, he needs to say so tonight. Because knowing that this year's yield of around 15 million lambs can be safely stored and enjoyed by consumers and therefore paid for would be of huge benefit to the 34,000 people currently employed in the industry. If that meat cannot be stored and sold, even at a knockdown price, the sector will be decimated. Yeah. The government has said that it is aware of the special circumstances that would lead to a substantial negative effect on the income of UK sheep farmers and that it would compensate farmers. To its credit, the government has pledged to continue to commit to the same cash total in funds for farm support until the end of this Parliament, although obviously that might be coming sooner than was anticipated. Financial support is already included in farmers' business plans, but it doesn't compensate farmers for sudden loss of market. It doesn't compensate farmers for feed costs for animals that they cannot now slaughter. It doesn't ensure that there's sufficient feed available to keep lambs bred for slaughter alive. It doesn't create abattoir or cold storage capacity, and it certainly doesn't create new export markets or offset tariffs, as that would be against WTO rules. In an answer to my written parliamentary question of the 18th of July, the then Minister said, "We are doing all we can to mitigate the challenges our farmers will face, and we have contingency plans in place to minimise disruption." But what ministers haven't done and continue to refuse to do is to explain what those contingency plans are. Having offered to meet me at the dispatch box, the Minister's predecessor offered to meet me to discuss this. The current Minister then declined that invitation and has refused to meet to discuss this issue. If a wasteful cull of millions of lambs and breeding ewes is to be avoided, Measures need to be put in place now. If the slaughter and storage facilities are not in place and no deal happens, farmers will have little option but to cull their flocks, and the meat won't be eaten and the waste will be shameful. The lack of new trading arrangements and any implementation period would mean that farmers will set about drastically reducing the size of their flocks. Chillingly, the AHDB says that in this situation, and I quote, culling rates would record significant uplift, driving the increase in adult sheep slaughterings. In Q1 of Year 2 of a no-deal Brexit, there will be an uplift in slaughterings as the remainder of the Year 1 lamb crop is slaughtered, estimated to be 3 million lambs. And that's at the lower end of the estimates. I give way to the gentleman.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She's making a very important speech. Perhaps you could enlighten us and confirm, but my understanding is that the breeding season is probably beginning just about to start, because the gestation is typically about 150 days, if I well recall. And so farmers must be planning now exactly what their programme is.
Yeah, very good point. That's exactly right. So typically, I think the phrase is in with a bang, out like a fool's, because they breed in end of October, beginning of November, and then the lambs arrive in the spring. And farmers, as the Minister well knows, make these arrangements and plan these things a very long way in advance, which is why we need at least, according to farming bodies, a 2 to 3 year transitional period. The report that I was referring to goes on that under a rapid response scenario, the national flock would be culled to reduce its size. It is very clear. I could raise the Honourable Lady, I think she was indicating.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Does she share my astonishment that the Welsh Secretary said over the summer that we could start exporting to Japan and that market has opened up? They don't eat lamb in Japan at the moment, and they're certainly not going to start eating it on the 1st of November just to oblige us.
I think that, I mean, the Honourable Lady, that's a very important point, because yes, in theory, given enough time, it may be possible to find new markets, but by then it will be too late, because our flock will have been decimated and it would take decades to rebuild. So should the situation improve in future years with new markets, it just might be possible for the flock to be re-established, but it really isn't likely. Once the breeding ewes are gone and their special characteristics have been lost, it will take years to recreate the unique features of our national flock. Tens of thousands of jobs and our treasured landscape would be lost. And this is all so preventable. A 2 to 3 year transitional deal, a minimum, is needed. We need agreements that recognise the safety and the quality of our produce, and critically, we must increase the capacity of those essential cold storage facilities now. When ministers reassure me and try to reassure farmers, they need to explain what precisely it is that they intend to do.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and this is a very important debate, particularly for my constituency of Gower, where the lamb industry is very vibrant. And does she share my concerns over the amount of cold storage that's going to be needed, and what the plans for the government of actually how much then is needed, because do we have enough actually for medicines in the country post-Brexit?
I think if any of us were in the business of cold storage or large-scale fridges, we'd be doing quite well at the moment. My understanding from the trade body that represents such businesses is that there is no additional capacity. So should this, this volume of meat become suddenly in need of storage, those facilities won't be there, and the safe consumption of that meat will not be a possible solution to this issue. You know, when I first heard about the mass culling of millions of lambs that would be rendered inedible, I just did not believe it. But then you read the reports, listen to what the National Farmers Union has to say, speak to agricultural workers and farmers across the country, it becomes very clear that this is not Project Fear. This is project, and I say to the Minister, please just get out from behind your ministerial desk and deal with this now, before it's too late.
I call the Minister, George Eustace, to reply to the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to congratulate the honourable member for Darlington for securing this important debate on a day when we've obviously had a lot of discussion already about EU exit. And I know that this is also an issue that she's raised in a series of parliamentary questions, and I want to address some of the concerns and issues that she's raised a little later on. But first of all, the sheep sector in the UK is an incredibly large and important sector. Combined with our upland and lowland sheep production, it's got an annual production value of around £1.26 billion in 2018, and this accounts for around 4.5% of all agricultural output in the UK. It's also, as a number of honourable members have pointed out, responsible for some of the most iconic landscapes that we have in the UK. And there are 16 million breeding ewes and some 70,000 sheep farms across the UK. And it's also the case that this is particularly important in some of the devolved regions. For instance, around 50% of UK sheep production on the flock is in Wales and Scotland. The UK is the largest producer of sheep meat in the EU, producing around 38% of all the sheep and goat meat produced in the EU last year. And the UK is also the world's third largest exporter of sheep meat in the world, behind New Zealand and Australia. So we are a truly global player in this sector. Around a third of our annual production of lamb is exported, and over 95% of this is, as the honourable member pointed out, to the European Union. Total lamb exports in 2018 were valued at around £384 million, with a large amount of that coming from the European Union. The main export destinations for lamb in 2018 was France, followed by Germany and Belgium. But for certain parts of the industry, notably those in Wales, which tend to produce smaller lambs, some of the Mediterranean countries such as Italy and Portugal are also very important purchasers of our goods as well. Some of our heavier lamb from the predominantly lowland areas are often sought more in Northern Europe. So we recognise that because of all of these factors, the sheep sector is the most exposed, and we've always acknowledged it's the most exposed sector in terms of its trading relationship with the European Union in the event of a no-deal exit. Now, in terms of managing those risks, we do have two very important factors going for us. The first is that we do have a very large domestic market for food in general and lamb in particular. The UK is actually, measured by import value, the world's third largest market for food and drink, coming only after China and Japan. And this means that there are actually many opportunities for import substitution, since we currently source a significant quantity of lamb from New Zealand in particular. The second very important thing that we have going for us is an independent exchange rate, an independent currency and a floating exchange rate, which is incredibly important for the agricultural sector. It helps as an automatic stabiliser when you have shocks. And as we now contemplate the prospect of potentially having to leave the European Union without a withdrawal agreement, that's not our preference, as all honourable members know, but as we have to contemplate that possibility, having a floating exchange rate makes that easier for the farming sector than it would have been had we become trapped in the euro some years ago. I will give it. Yes,
Astounded by what the Minister has just said, since the referendum, the pound has fallen by 20%. That means for every export, the farmers are getting 20% less money. How can that be good for them?
The Honourable Lady has it the wrong way round. It is always the case that for sectors that are producing goods, such as agriculture, a weaker exchange rate against the euro leads to higher prices for agriculture. And it's no there's no secret that since the referendum result in 2016, where there was an adjustment of sterling against the euro, agricultural commodity prices in the UK have been at highs, and that has helped farm incomes. That's a recognised fact. Exchange rates are a key driver of agricultural commodity prices. However, we recognise that even with these important factors going in our favour, the sector is still exposed. Some modelling has been done on this issue by a number of different organisations, including the National Farmers Union. It's important to recognise that tariffs are a tax on consumers, first and foremost. And there are, therefore, some estimates that anticipate that were the EU to apply full MFN tariffs, most favoured nation tariffs, on lamb, there would likely be increases in consumer prices in the EU of perhaps up to around 20%. And that reflects the fact that the UK is the dominant lamb producer in the European Union, and there are limited other options that they would have to source their lamb. I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. He just said if we were to choose to apply most favoured nations. Now, I profess not to be an expert in the sheep industry, but certainly in ceramics, we've been told there is no choice over most favoured nations. It is the tariff you have to apply to abide by WTO rules. So, as the Minister now says in the dispatch box, there is discretion that the government can apply over this, and if so, can he outline what that plan is?
Yes, absolutely, there's discretion. And so the UK government's already indicated what its tariff schedule would be in a no-deal scenario. Governments have the opportunity to have a lower applied tariff, lower than the bound tariff set in the WTO. And it's also an option open to any government to unilaterally suspend tariffs. And indeed, it would be open to the European Union, should they want to have either a tariff suspension, which I think is unlikely, or more likely the creation of an autonomous tariff rate quota for lamb that would be open to the whole world, including the UK. So there are many options that both the European Union and the British government have to unilaterally apply tariffs that are lower than the WTO-bound tariff. However, it is important to recognise, as I said, that we are the dominant producer. It is possible that the European Union could source more product from the New Zealand production, provided they had access to the ceiling currently set with that TRQ that exists in the EU. It's also possible in the medium term that countries like Spain could increase their production, but they're unlikely to be able to do that in the short term. So for those reasons, it is likely that there would be an increase in consumer prices in the European Union as a result of them applying the full MFN tariff. It's also important to recognise, though, that that increase in price would then dampen demand in the European Union, and the modelling suggests that would increase supply on the domestic market. And the modelling generally suggests that prices as a result in the UK could fall by up to 30%. But to put that into context, that means prices going back down to roughly where they were in 2015. 2015 was a very difficult year for the sheep sector, and what we are talking about here is a significant potential reduction, but not unprecedented, and certainly simply back to levels prior to that referendum result. I will give way.
On a recent visit to New Zealand with the Welsh Affairs Committee, we went and visited the sheep and beef industry, which was very, very interesting. Now, our farmers have a worry that our markets are going to be flooded with cheap New Zealand lamb. Yeah. What can the Minister say to allay those fears of our farmers?
Well, the government's already made clear that because of the particular sensitivity on lamb, we will apply full MFN tariffs on lamb, so there will not be any additional imports to the UK beyond those we already have. There is a splitting of the existing TRQ, the tariff rate quota for New Zealand lamb, between the UK and New Zealand, and that's a combined total of around 250,000 tonnes, which will still come in, but there will be no additional lamb because we will be applying full MFN tariffs outside that TRQ. I will be.
How the tariff is going to work between the Europe and the UK. Has that been decided? How much, what percentage of that tariff is going to go to which to the UK or Europe?
Yes, that's been decided, and it's one of the few areas actually where the European Union has from the very beginning been willing to work with the UK on agreeing a splitting of the tariff rate quota schedules, and those have been already lodged with the World Trade Organisation. However, we do recognise, as I said, that in a no-deal scenario, that we have to show some solidarity with the sector, who will nevertheless face potential significant falls in prices back down to levels not seen since 2015. So, as the Prime Minister has said, I will give that.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I welcome him back to the dispatch box, and he is giving a strong account for this important sector. In my summer surgery tour, farmers from Tomintoul to Rothy expressed their concerns about the future of this industry. What reassurance can he give on behalf of the Government that this is an issue that is being treated with the utmost priority, and what can he say tonight that can reassure my farmers, sheep farmers in Murray, across Scotland and the UK?
Well, I can give him absolutely that reassurance, and he will be aware that the Government is obviously seeking a free trade agreement with the European Union in the medium to long term, and if we can get it in the short term. But in the short term, the Prime Minister has already made clear that in the event of a no-deal exit, we will show solidarity with the sheep industry, and we will make interventions where necessary to support farmers' incomes. The Honourable Member for Bishop... I'm going to conclude because we're running out of time. The Honourable Member for Bishop Auckland earlier raised an important issue, which is whether we have the legal vires to do this. I can confirm that we do. The Government has a number of legislative vehicles that can do this, including elements of retained EU law, but also the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act has general grant-making powers that give us the ability to do this. And there are two possible options that we are considering. One would be a headage payment on breeding ewes, should that be necessary, and that would be important in the event that farmers producing lambs are the ones who have the shock to their income. The second option would be something called a slaughterhouse premium, where you would effectively make a supplementary top-up payment to lambs at the point of slaughter. We could use a combination of those options, but broadly speaking, a headage payment income support approach we believe would be the right approach to adopt. Now, the scale or need, I'm going to conclude because we're running out of time. The scale or need for any intervention is difficult to judge at this point because it will depend quite considerably on the approach that the European Union finally take. As I said earlier, it is open to them to create an autonomous tariff rate quota, but also it's highly dependent on the extent of exchange rates. But I can give honourable members an undertaking tonight to reassure them that the Rural Payments Agency have already been told to design the administrative procedures necessary to make such headage payments, and discussions with the Treasury are at an advanced stage about what support may need to be set aside, while recognising that no final decisions can be taken until we actually leave the European Union. I know that the honourable member for Darlington has previously raised the issue of culling sheep, which he's raised again tonight. I can confirm that that is not under consideration. We regard any problems as being potentially a short-term problem, and the correct approach would be to supplement farmers' incomes through the headage payment schemes I've described. We do not want to reduce the capacity of our flock. We are a global player in this sector, and we have we believe, a bright future for our sheep sector. However, in the unlikely event that it becomes not possible to get a longer-term free trade agreement with the European Union, then, of course, there are other approaches that we can take. Our existing tariff rate policy is set for just 12 months. It is open to us in future to review that, to apply certain tariffs to other EU sectors in order to give our farmers opportunities to diversify into different sectors, such as beef, and many of our sheep producers are mixed beef and sheep enterprises. And it's also open to us to support the opening of new markets, for instance, through the deployment of new attachés to our embassy to help gain that market access. The honourable member, I know, said that that was against WTO rules. That's not correct. Certain types of export refunds are against WTO convention, but there is no rule against investment to support market access. So, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we recognise that the sheep sector, more than any other agricultural sector, is exposed because of the scale of its exports to the European Union, but the Government has been working for the last 2 years years on modelling the potential impacts and planning the types of interventions we may need to make in order to ensure that our sheep farmers are protected from any no-deal exit.
Order. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.